Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Refocus Your Focus, Do More with Less with Lean Six Sigma. I'm Janice Kaplan, the Content Marketing Specialist for James Moore & Company, and I'll be your host today. With me to present is James Moore partner Mike Sibley. If you haven't had the pleasure of meeting or working with him, Mike is the partner in charge of our firm's Daytona Beach and DeLand offices. He has over 20 years of accounting and auditing experience and is a certified black belt in Lean Six Sigma. Mike has worked with clients across many industries, including government, not only on accounting matters, but also to help them operate more efficiently, and as the title says, do more with less. Finally, our webinar will include a few local government case studies for Lean Six Sigma. That said, we also have experience working with higher education clients on these projects. For those of you in that industry, let us know in the Q&A if you'd like more information, and we'll reach out to you at a later date to help you. Okay, with all that said, I'll hand things over to Mike so we can get started. Mike, go ahead.
Thank you, Janice. I appreciate it. And welcome everybody to our session on doing more with less with Lean Six Sigma. Today, as you can see, we've got quite a bit of an agenda to go through in just a little over an hour's worth of time. So really the goal for today is to hopefully get you a couple of nuggets that you can walk away with to begin looking at really improving processes internally in a little different way. I know a lot of times I'll talk to clients and they'll have undergone some process improvement or trying to really take a look at how to do things better, but they fall short. They have problems from a project management standpoint or identifying really what are the right things. And so hopefully today you'll be able to take away a few nuggets of information. Generally, when I do really certification courses and they're longer sessions. So a lot of the stuff we're going over is really just the nuts and bolts. But generally, we use the same exact presentation to actually go 4 hours, 8 hours, even 3 days with basically the same information. First, though, just hitting the agenda. I did want to mention the CARES Act assistance for governments. During last week's webinar, we did discuss and work through budgeting in a COVID-19 world and touched on the CARES Act funding that the state of Florida is getting ready to distribute. So we want to let you know that we are offering services to help governments manage this funding. We can assist you with expenditure compliance analysis, small business and other grant program development, application review process assistance, compliance assessments, and administration and reporting. So if that's something that you feel you'll need some assistance with, feel free to reach out to us and we'd be happy to talk you through that. So getting into the agenda, I want to talk a little bit about what is Lean Six Sigma. We're not going to do a simulation. I have that in there. Like I said, this is kind of something that presentation we do quite a bit. I am going to talk about the 5 principles of Lean, the 9 categories of waste, and this is really the area I want to focus on in terms of the types of waste, because I think that's going to give you perspective. And this is what I tell clients, even when we're going through process improvement initiatives, make sure you have a copy of these 9 categories of waste. So when you're really evaluating a process, to understand what is a waste, what is slowing down the process, what is bogging it down. So these are going to be really important categories to really understand and go through. Lean practices in action. I want to talk a little bit about, obviously, we got COVID. This is a big issue. A huge issue, and it's affecting everybody. We've got people working at home, we've got some people in the offices, we've got internal control changes, process changes, and it's such a huge thing. And I think Lean Six Sigma, the process of utilizing Lean Six Sigma, can help you in terms of managing to change the way you do things, change the way you look at things, how you're going to address social distancing requirements. And I'm sure many of you have already been going through that, or in that, or constantly evaluating that as we progress. So that's an area that, this is some tools that I think you can continue to use to help improve that. And of course, we'll talk about some success stories, and if there's time, Q&A. Certainly, if we don't get to the Q&A, feel free to send us an email. We'll be happy to respond as soon as we can on that. So when I jump into this, I always start with what is the goal. And when we're talking about a business, so businesses make money. That's their goal, is to make money. And if a business is not making money, they're not going to survive. But when we're talking about higher education, for example, or governments, we have a little different goal, because the goal isn't necessarily to make money. It's efficient use of entrusted resources. And this is kind of my words. I'm sure you all can think about a different way, but you're entrusted with resources, and you need to be efficient with those resources. You have customers that you're serving, you have citizens that you're serving, you have people that you're serving, and you need to be efficient with those resources, because it's hard to just say, okay, you don't have a business development model where you're gonna go get more business. You have tax rates perhaps, or you're setting tuition or those things, and it's not easy to just raise those things and expect to get more revenue for your organization. So it's really critical that we make sure that we're efficient with the use of our resources, and I think that's one of the goals. At the same time, you've got to be able to provide services to citizens, so our local governments. There's an expectation of providing efficient resources or services to your citizens, and so that is something that we try to say, this is your purpose, this is your goal. Obviously you have other goals. There's public safety, or if you're in higher ed, it might be the entertainment of a football game, putting those on, whatever the case might be. There's other goals, but in terms of resources and processes, this is one of the goals. And we talk about benefits of implementation. And when I'm talking about implementation, I'm talking about using these tools to improve your processes. And oftentimes what we end up seeing is companies, organizations tend to focus on improvements when times get really tough, or when, as of right now, we saw it many years ago when we had the recession, people focused on improvements. How do we do more with less? And now we spent a lot of time talking about doing more with less. And when times start to get really good, it's easier to hire more people and let operations kind of, maybe processes get a little bit fat, so to speak. And so here we are again in a situation when we may not have everybody available to us. Some people may not be able to work. Some people may not be able to work from home. So you're back into, okay, we've got to be efficient with our resources. Every organization, government, nonprofits and higher ed, and you're looking at the potential of funding reductions in some way, shape, or form, and you've got to figure out how to do more with less. But this is something that can be applied at any time. And in fact, even when things get busier, sometimes those are the hardest times to not be focusing on this, because people get really, really stressed out. There's a lot more activity. There's things you're so focused on, you don't get to focus on these improvement projects. But really, when we talk about implementing a Lean Six Sigma type process, we're talking about improving your operations. We want to increase your capacity. Every organization, a process is throughput, and we want to increase that throughput and that capacity ability, so you can take on more, so that way you can grow, you have scalability in your organization. We want better quality from the start, and that's one of the key things that you're going to see in the next couple of minutes here in terms of this process about quality. And when you build it in from the start, in any process I've ever seen, when you don't build quality in from the start, it's like a snowball effect. It gets worse and worse and worse as you go. You end up having lots of errors. You got to send it back, and whatever it is that you're trying to get through the door, out the door, is not moving very quickly. We also know that less management time in the mud, meaning their management is more in the details than they need to be. It doesn't allow them to do high-level activities. Increased citizen satisfaction, as we talked about, decreased costs, reduced turnaround time, improved employee morale. I can tell you, some of the examples that we have later on. Employee morale was a big deal. It was hurting. These things were just examples of situations in this organization that were slowing things down. People working a lot of overtime, and it was really, really hard. And so, it does improve morale when you see the results and things moving quickly and people not bogged down in things. Better inventory management, we'll talk about that. Improved communication. We see so much silo impact, and really processes and transactions move across departments often. And you end up in these silo situations where you do what you do, but somebody else does what they just take whatever you're giving them or whatever they receive, and no matter the condition, and they could get frustrated by it as opposed to working together. And we've got lots of examples of that. And then of course, better utilization of people's talents. That's leverage, that's level loading. That's using people available to reduce the time for other people. So let's get into it. What is lean? There's two components. I've said Lean Six Sigma. So there's lean and then there's Six Sigma. Lean is about efficiency, building capacity in the process, about value adding, only doing those things that are value added. And it's eliminating waste from the process. So that way you can get things through very, very efficiently, faster. Now, I didn't mention quality. Quality is very much a part of this. We want quality. We want it to be value added only option ideas. So if it's not adding value to the process, if it's errors as an example, if it's too much transportation in the process, and we'll talk about, that's not adding value. We want to only do those things that add value to the process. Adding value is it meets a requirement. You might have an ordinance or a state law that you have to follow. It's what the customer values, and we'll talk about who the customer is. So it's only those things that provide value because you have to do it by some statute. And we'll even, I had a situation where we were looking at compliance ordinances, and that particular city was applying laws that didn't actually apply to it. And so they were bogging down their system because they were applying more than they needed to. That's not value added. And so that's what we want to do, is really evaluate what is value added, what is required, and get rid of everything else. Then we talk about Six Sigma. Six Sigma is about developing consistency in processes. Again, building capacity and value, but Six Sigma is statistical analysis. It's really looking at the processes and the consistency across everybody's performing the same function. So for example, if you have 3 customer service reps taking in cash receipts for utility bills, they do the same exact thing, the same exact way. And you don't have one person, each person that's created their own process and way of doing things. You have an exact way that you do it. So the consistency, so the customer service model comes in as the same every single time. And, of course, one of the sayings I love is there's never time to do a job right, but always time to do it over again. And I can't tell you how many times we come across that situation where, we're just pushing things as fast as we can down. And even though it's not right, we're expecting the next person in line to fix it. But, we know we're probably going to have to fix it. Just do it right the first time. That's what we want to get to in this entire process. So then when we combine the two, we've got Lean Six Sigma. So we've got Lean accelerating, we've got Six Sigma as a problem solving process. And the goal is that we're able to push our transactions, push our processes much quicker, and with quality, reduce the defects, reduce the waste. And again, what the process I'm about to show you is a model to use to analyze, beat it up, and come up with new processes. What it's not, though, it's not about finding ways to just eliminate people. Generally speaking, when we talk about this, we don't want to undergo it, eliminate people, and then expect people to be on board with the next process improvement, because that could eliminate more jobs. If you've got, the way we look at it is, this is about freeing up capacities so we can either level load better, and we'll talk about what that means, so we can level load better, or so we have increased capacity so we can provide better service and even process more transactions. If there's a problem employee who needs to go for some reason, they just don't belong with the organization anymore, that person needs to be terminated before you go through this process. You do not want to connect the two. It's also not about necessarily spending more money either, because oftentimes the solutions that I've seen are technologies that are already on hand. It's resources that are already on hand. It's tweaking, it's eliminating, it's modifying what you have. Now, sometimes there are times when you do have situations where there are resources being expended. In other words, cash being spent. For example, we worked on a housing project with the university to, among other things, was to move students in and out of housing much quicker, much more automated, And so there was a process where they were implementing some new software. Well, on top of that, we worked with them to change the processes to work within the software, so they had a very automated, efficient process to checking students in and out. So they were spending some money on a new software, but we wanted to make sure the processes that went along with it were very efficient, and that the software could be modified to meet what was an efficient use of those resources. So in that particular case, there was some resources expended. But oftentimes one of the things I hear, and when I do our simulations, the answer is always to add more people. Well, that's not necessarily the case. First things first, let's see what we can eliminate for waste, eliminate problems, and then we'll see where we're at. It may be that you have to hire more people, but we don't want to automatically jump to that. All right, so I'm going to give a second here. Our first polling question, just to make sure everybody's awake and staying focused here, is: have your operation in any department been significantly affected? I'm sure they've been significantly affected, but shut down, and are you not be able to provide those services? It's just a simple yes or no. I'm sure a lot have been pretty significantly impacted. So we'll give that a second, Tim.
I'll take just a quick note. You may need to exit. If you don't see the blue question panel, you might need to exit full screen mode to view the question. So we'll give you another several seconds to answer. Okay, we're going to go ahead and close out the question. And let's see the results.
So yes, pretty significant. Actually, some a higher percentage no than I would have thought. So that's interesting results. But we have a lot of different organizations on here. Oh, it keeps going up. So we got quite a few yes, and that's obvious. And that really, again, leads more to exactly what we've been talking about here, is that operations have been significantly affected. Yesterday, actually, we spent the day in an A&A update, so an accounting and auditing update, and we were talking about internal controls and how have internal controls been affected, how have processes been affected, and are you able to still do that? And of course, now is a good time to tackle this process. And even without getting into process improvement, as much as how do we make sure our processes are still working and effective in remote environments, in situations where we have partial remote, partial not remote. So this is a good way. And this model right here is exactly the model that we use to go through process improvement. In short, we call it DMAIC: define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. This is how we work through. This is a project management tool. This is part of the Six Sigma model. The first thing we do when we get a project is we begin with the end in mind. We talk about where are we trying to go with this. In that, we create a project charter. And that project charter talks about who's on the team, and I'll talk about teams and champions and all that kind of stuff, but who's going to be involved in this? What's our business problem that we're trying to solve? Because we also have to make sure that, when we go to management and want to make sure that that they agree that we need to solve this business problem. So it defines the business problem, it defines the resources needed, defines the timing of the project in terms of how long we're going to have available, and then it defines, what are our expected outcomes? How will we know when we've accomplished this? And it's important to get everybody on the same page with that, because when you get done and you improve your process, do you believe that this process is going to get you where you want it to be? So we focus very much on that define piece. Projects, the biggest problem with these process improvement initiatives is they often fall apart because of timing, because lack of structure around the project management. And this is the beginning of putting that project management together. The next thing we do is we measure it. We determine what the current state is. The current state is exactly what you're doing right now. And we usually do this in the form of flowcharts. So we actually walk through the process exactly as it happens, and we document what is the process, what is the current state, and we talk to the people doing the work. Tell us what you do as you go through this process. We'll get metrics. How many of an item are you processing? How long does it take to complete this? We'll get metrics around that, so we have some data inputs to say, so we understand when we do the improvement where we want to get to. So we measure the process, we step through, we put it into a visual state, because when you put it in a visual state, you can see this. I'm going to show you an example of this in a little bit, just a very brief example of what it would look like. Then we analyze it. So we beat it up. We start with, we kind of break it down into small phases, and we analyze each phase for what can go wrong. What are our risks? What are creating problems for us? Where are our areas? What's our waste in this process? And we really, really beat it up. And then if we're not sure about something, we'll stop, we'll assign some homework to go dig into, is this the problem we think it is? Sometimes in this area, you'll see customer surveys, employee surveys to help get more information around that. And then finally, once we've analyzed it and determined what all the problems are, all the issues are, and we're gonna focus, when we find these, we're gonna identify what our riskiest, what our most impactful areas are. So in other words, you might find 10 problems, 3 of them are so minor you can just make quick changes and move on, but some of them are real significant, and we're going to focus on the real significant ones first and solve those problems. And that's the improvement process. So then we sit there and we work, and as a team of about 6 to 10 people, and I'll explain how that team is designed, we improve it. How are we going to do this? You improve it, and then you can take it and you can test it. Certainly you may come up with ideas that don't perfectly work, but it's a matter of failing forward. So try it. If it doesn't work, tweak it. Make it so it works for your situation, but improve it. And then control. So the control is having a process document. And one of the things that is often lacking in organizations is a process document so if you were to replace one person with the next, they could pick up this process document, and they would first and foremost understand the expectations. That is often the #1 missing thing from a process, is what are the expectations for the people who are involved? What's the turnaround time? What's the quality time? If I'm signing off on this paperwork, what should this paperwork look like? How do we do the process? So the controls put into place what is the process, so that way you can turn it over to the next person and they would understand what you're trying to get at that way. And then you can design metrics to make sure that the controls are working, the time frames, the quantities that you want, the quality, all of those things. So it's a very intensive process to go through, but at the end, you have a process that's far more improved than what you have currently. So I've been talking about a team, and what we refer to is a cross-functional team. And we refer to it as a TOPS model. So it's team-oriented problem solving. Too often in organizations, what ends up happening is somebody sees a problem and they go and they almost dictate from management down. We're going to do this now. We've decided this is the way it's going to work. And the problem with that is, for the most part, management's not the one usually doing the work. So we want to get what's called subject experts. They are the people that are doing the work. Now, there may be 5 or 6 people doing the same function. You don't need all 5 or 6 of them, but you do need at least 1 or 2 of them on the team, because they know exactly what they're doing. They know exactly what the problems are. They know exactly what the wastes are. They know exactly what frustrates them. So we build a team of cross-functional experts. So when you look at a process, we say, okay, what's the very start of this process? What's the very end of this process? And let's get some representatives from each section of this process. You might have a facilitator. That's something that we do, is facilitate these conversations, because one of the problems when you get into a team situation is not everybody will talk, or they won't share, or you guys are so deep into it that you can't see the forest for the trees, and that's where the facilitator comes in. And even if it's a facilitator that's internal, use one that's not involved in the process, that's good at navigating groups of people. There's a team leader, and a team leader is the person who's got kind of the most at stake in this project. In other words, they're probably the one overseeing this process. They're overseeing maybe that department or departments. And then of course a champion is the person who's got the ultimate authority to say, kind of use the term beat them over the head if they don't listen, so to speak, right? So they're the ones that can hold people accountable. And oftentimes it's our management function level where these processes, these initiatives fall apart, because you got new processes and they follow and no one follows them, or you've got a key leader who says, I don't want to do it that way. It's a waste of time. I don't like that. I like my old way of doing it. And the champion is the one that's got to be able to say, this is important to this organization. I believe in this. I believe in the team, and whatever the team comes back with, we're going to follow and allow them to implement it in a way that we are going to be supportive of. That's why the champion's important. This team becomes part of that DMAIC. They produce the DMAIC model. They run that DMAIC model. And of course, I got the saying here, no one knows the work like the people doing it. Again, that's why we focus on the cross-functional experts, okay? And we talked about management management and commitment is essential. You have to be, management has to be approving of this. They have to buy into it. And in fact, management can even be on the team in some cases. The worry would be obviously that people won't talk if management is in there, but I have done it that way as well. Then we have the 5 principles of lean. So we've been talking about Six Sigma. Six Sigma is that DMAIC model, it's statistics. So that's the model that we use, that project management model. But now we want to talk a little bit about lean and the 5 principles of lean. So the first one is that customers define value. And so it's important that when we say who is the customer, well, the voice of the customer, so it's the end customer who's paying for the service. It might be outside compliance agencies and readers of data, or they're an internal customer. They're the next person. And so let's just say I'm the next person down, and the person that I'm always receiving information from is always creating errors. Well, they're not considering that now I've got to do more work because I've either got to send it back, I've got to look over it, it's a waste of my time, and I'm sending it back, or I'm just going to fix it and move it on. They're not considering me as the next person down. And so value to me would be they do their job right, they hit it right. And the question is, what's causing that person to not do the work right? So when we talk about the first principle of lean, and so when you're developing this new process, the customers define value. What is required here? The next person down, is it a state agency? Is it an end customer that is paying for a service? So understand value from that standpoint. Then understand the value stream. What is value add and what is waste? So the value stream, if you remember back to the DMAIC model that we just talked about a few minutes ago, measure. We're going to measure the value stream. A value stream is the process that happens. We can think about it in terms of flow charts. So that's the exact process. And what we want to do is identify the value stream as it stands now, the current state. We're going to measure it. Then we're going to create a true value stream that adds value and eliminates waste from it. And we want to make the process flow, meaning we want it constantly going forward. And what does that mean, going forward? Well, I just gave you an example of what if I'm the next person down the process and I'm constantly getting paperwork with errors in it and I'm sending it backwards. Well, that's going backwards. Think about a manufacturing process where you have a raw material that's moving its way down the conveyor belt and having value added to it as it goes. If we had to constantly stop that, take that item off and move it backwards because there was errors on it, the process isn't flowing. Okay, so that makes a big difference and it eliminates waste. And we want to implement pull to the process. Oftentimes we have a situation where we're pushing work, we're pushing things down the stream, even though the person downstream is not ready for it, or perhaps we're pushing things downstream that aren't even a priority right now. It's not an issue we need to deal with. We're not prioritizing the right things, and so we don't have that pull process. We're pushing work onto people and creating more stress. And then, of course, continuous improvement. Even when you think you're done, even when you fix these processes, you're not done because things change, technologies change, customers change, values change, things change as you go. And so you got to constantly be improving your organization. Otherwise, you're going to fall behind and get back into creating more problems. So at the very beginning, I talked about having nuggets to take away. So the very first nugget we talked about was the DMAIC model. We're going to define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. It's a powerful project management tool. We use it all the time with our clients. Very, very effective. So that's certainly a tool that you should be using. The next one is these 5 principles of lean. Understand in process improvement that understand what value is. You only need things in the process that are of value. That doesn't mean if somebody thinks that an internal control is not value, that doesn't mean you take it out. You got to have internal controls. If you've got a ordinance or you got a state law or some regulation you have to follow, you got to do it. That's not something you can change. What I'm suggesting is don't overdo it. I've seen situations where, and I'll show you an example, where there's so many approvals in the process, you get to the point where it's not even adding any, there's no control there. It's just redundancy at that point. Or you get safety checks. Well, this person, for some reason, it's always wrong. So we implemented extra sets of eyes to go through the process, because that way we make sure it doesn't go out wrong. Well, how about you fix it from the beginning so that way it doesn't create those errors? So remember the DMAIC model and the 5 principles of lean as your nuggets in terms of your process improvement. And then the 9 categories of waste. Super important. Every single time that I go through a process improvement initiative, once we get to the analyze stage and we're analyzing, this is where I make sure everybody's got a printout of it and is looking for these types of wastes. So you'll notice we've conveniently arranged it so it says downtime plus attitude. So we have defects, overproduction, waiting, not utilizing people's talents, transportation, inventory, motion, excess processing, attitude. And I'm gonna go through what these mean. So defects, these are errors. I've used errors a number of times as examples here, but we've got errors in the process or not following procedures and quality guidelines. So what happens? You have rework, you have opportunity cost, loss, poor service, non-compliance, bottlenecks, frustration, and stress. So what are some of the tools that we can use to overcome these? Well, Pareto charts. If you remember, Pareto is the 80-20 rule. We want to understand what's causing it. If you've got the 80-20, you've got a few things that are causing 80% of your problems. Well, you can focus on fixing those. Feedback, consistency in the process, quick checks. These are not safety checks, but they're really quick pieces that somebody can themselves, when they're, say I'm filling out a piece of paperwork, I can do a quick check based on a guide that I have, not a checklist, because I'm not really a big checklist fan necessarily, but I can use a quick check to say, hey, does this meet our expectations, and move it on. Pokeyoke, Japanese term. You'll see a lot of Japanese terms. Obviously, if you go, this is something that is really kind of developed out of the Toyota production system. So when you talk about lean, it has its dates back into really kind of Toyota production, even to some case Ford, going way back with Henry Ford when he had the way they had the assembly line creations. But you'll see a lot of Japanese terms in this because of the history of it. And then of course training. But what we want to do is be able to identify if there's defects in the process. So when you're breaking down, you're identifying it, look for where errors are, and then get into why are the errors happening and how do we stop those from happening from the beginning. Let's not put things in place to catch errors as much as let's put things in place to make sure that they don't happen to begin with. And I think one thing that's important when I'm evaluating a process, people get a little bit defensive at first, thinking that the problems that you're identifying is their fault. My standard approach, first and foremost, is it's not the person's fault, it's the process's fault. Now, once you fix processes and if that person continues to have errors and they're not following it, then it becomes the person's fault. But generally speaking, people sometimes fail or not do the job as well as they could because the process itself is not well designed. And that's where we want to give an opportunity to fix it and let employees do the things that they do well. Overproduction. This is significant time on tasks that do not take precedence. For example, if you were a manufacturer, this is an easy visual. You produce inventory and nobody wants it. There's no demand for it, but you're just producing it to put it on the shelves. This is work that you're doing that is not the priority right now. Other things are needed, and it could even get to the extent of busy work. So what happens, it creates work in process. Even, yes, believe it or not, as government entities, as higher ed entities, or any other organizations that are represented on this, you do have work in process. You have projects, you have paperwork that's in process, you have other things that are sitting on your desk in a pile that needs to be dealt with at some point. It creates lost capacity. So if somebody's spending time on something that's not prioritized or not important, we need to help them manage their time, but also use that person to take work off of other people. We're going to talk about that in a second. So there's lost capacity. Again, there's bottlenecks and you have strain. So we want to manage the front door. And that means really understand and set priorities in a way that allows work to move through the process. Waiting. Think about waiting. Let's just say I write a memo and I send it over to you to be approved, and you sit on it for 3 weeks and you have questions and you send it back to me. The first thing I'm going to do is I have to spend time figuring out, what was this memo again? So you have this learning curve that ends up, back on my plate where I got to spend 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes or so just remembering what I did. So waiting creates, just lost time. It's something that's sitting there, not being utilized. It's not moving in the process. Think about, again, the inventory. You've got emails that are inventory. You've got paperwork that's inventory, and it's just sitting waiting. It could be an approval that needs to happen. So, it's slowing down the process, and waiting is just a waste. It increased costs. There's capacity loss. You got this buildup again. And so you want to analyze the process that it could be waiting because the person is so busy that they can't even get to it. Meanwhile, another person is kind of sitting around, maybe even twiddling their thumbs, waiting for this stuff to come back. You might have a vendor that needs to be paid. You might have a project that's waiting to get started, and they can't because it's waiting for some level of approval. So waiting can really slow things down and certainly add costs from that standpoint. And I've alluded to this many times, not utilizing people's talents. In some cases, you have higher skilled people performing lower skilled work, or you've got staff, and I've seen it a lot with administrative staff. You've got perhaps receptionists or others that have the ability to do more work. All they need is a little bit of training and they can take on work. Or you've got other people who are just, they have capacity because they can burn through their work so quickly. And oftentimes what we find is work expands the time available. So if somebody's not utilizing that urgency, so the urgency isn't there, they're going to slow down in their work product and look like they're busy. And it's not because they don't want to, but because they've got nothing else to do and they don't want to sit around, seem like they're not adding value to the organization. So that's another area that you can better understand who's got availability, who should be doing certain things and who shouldn't be, and maximizing the strengths of your staff across the board. And that's something that's really, really important through this process, is level loading. And oftentimes what we see, and we do a simulation with Legos, and we build these airplanes and things like that, and we use it as an example because when you have too many processes in one step and other people on before and after that person have very little, they can bottleneck that person. That person becomes a bottleneck. Well, you can expand that a little bit and have people on either side of them help out and improve the flow, so that way all these extra steps aren't on one person. You can really, really level load that. This is a really critical tool. Oftentimes it's one of the best tools, is really understanding where you can leverage the work to. Transportation, so this is moving around. This could be, we have an example I'll show you earlier where they were literally walking pieces of paper throughout the organization. Well, just the time it takes to go from one end to the other, or if you're constantly up and down moving to the printer, those kind of things. Or you've got to be able to send, if you've got different offices in different locations, if you're not using technology to use. I had an example of a manufacturer where literally the process, when I did a spaghetti diagram is a diagram that maps out the process, and by the time you're done, it looks like a plate of spaghetti. The process was over 2 miles of walking. When we got done using technology and resources internally, we got it down to basically less than 1/4 mile of walking, which was substantial and saved us a substantial amount of time. So transportation can increase your costs that way, increase employee costs. It loses capacity because somebody's walking around, rather than doing work and utilizing technology. And so the way to be able to see this is using these value stream maps, using spaghetti diagrams to map out exactly what's happening in the process. Inventory, again, filled inboxes, work in process, that's stacks of paperwork that need to get out the door, emails, things like that. Inventory could be a physical stuff. Look at your storage supplies even. So what happens, it creates stress. I know personally, if my emails start stacking up, it stresses me out. I got to try and keep that clean at all time. You know, frustrates people. You get bottlenecks, things of that nature. You know, we're not going to talk too much about 5S, but 5S is about workplace organization, for example, on your desk, putting the tools in the place that you need them. Used to be that I would have like a hole punch and a stapler and all that kind of stuff. Now I don't use that stuff, but I would have them in the spots I needed them. So that way I could easily reach them, get them, use them. My phone's in the right spot. Now, of course, you don't need any of that stuff like you used to, but you do have workplaces. You do have maintenance departments, and you might even see where they've organized boards that have outlines of where the hammer goes or this tool or that tool goes. That makes it quicker, so they can walk in and say, that everything is organized, it's in the right spot. And we can do that for our offices as well. So it is just one of the tools that we use depending on the situation. So inventory is definitely an area that you really look at, and you start talking about email as an example. We use a 3 email rule. If we can't solve it in 3 emails, pick up the phone. If you're looking at somebody emails you and you say it's going to take me 15 minutes to type this email, I can probably explain it to them in 3 minutes. And then what's going to happen is they're not going to understand something in my email. They're going to email you back, and next thing you know, we're into a dozen emails before we've actually resolved the issue, or you end up just going to pick up the phone call to begin with. So I'm not email in my mind is one of the biggest time constraint. It just eats up time when picking up the phone is often the better way to go. Motion is is the next one, and that's a search party. So let's just say files are always missing, or even on your file systems, your network, you can't find documents, you have difficulty, so you're kind of in this search for things, or you don't know where somebody is, or whatever the case might be. So you're forms, supplies, things like that. So it does create more cycle time. So what we want to do is we want to reduce that motion. We want to organize things. We want to make sure it makes sense, because all of that stuff just creates more time for you in a day than you need. Excess processing, again, it's very similar to overproduction, but it's just overdoing the work that you're doing right now. Maybe it's a prioritized project, but you're going beyond what the expectations are. You're doing things, and I always use the example in accounting where we print reports for management or for a certain department, and you go talk to that department and say, what do you look at? And they say, well, I look at the first 3 pages. I don't need any of this other stuff. I don't even know what it is. I see that all the time. Why? Because we're not understanding the voice of the customer. We didn't go to the customer and say, what are you specifically looking for? And so that becomes a little bit of, so that's another area that when you create your value stream map and you're going through and you're looking at where does this hit? What are the things that we're focused on here? Go talk to the customers, understand, and again, use the concept of your internal customer versus your external customer to make sure that you're giving them what they need, and that's where the value comes in. Okay. And then attitude, and this one comes in, and I can share whether you think you can or think you can't. You're right. And what happens oftentimes is we get into these discussions about changing processes, and then you get people that say, we can't do it this way. We can't. I don't want to. And you got to really drill down into what's going on there, because I've even had situations where I've had teams, and I had a CFO of a large organization who was just combative the entire time. Finally had to go to that person's supervisor and talk to them and said, this isn't working. That we're not going to get anything resolved. This person doesn't want to change any process. And of course, they were supportive of the idea of fixing things, but didn't want to fix anything. And so in that particular case, she was right. We couldn't do it until we finally had to remove her out of the process, and everything got fixed. And it was a tremendous change for this organization. And so, that's why I take the approach of let's fail forward. Let's fix things. Let's try things. Because, let's just say you make 4 improvements. and 3 of them work great and 1 of them doesn't. Well, that's not a reason to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We want to fail forward and say, okay, we're going to fix it. We can test it. We can tweak it over time, but we're going to get it right. You know, and ultimately we're going to do the best that we can. It's going to be better than we are right now. So that's, you know, that's where attitude comes in that process. So, you know, again, I want to reiterate, and I'm going to keep, because I want to make sure that you guys understand exactly what you can pull out of this. First thing is, again, using that DMAIC model for project management. Define it, measure it, analyze it, improve it, and control it. I was meeting with a client the other day, and they kind of want to do this internally, and they want to start the process. And he kind of wrote down some notes about what their process is. And I was like, well, what happens here and what happens there? And didn't realize. I said, okay, step back. I want you to give me a value stream map. Value stream map out the process. You can use simple tools like Excel. There's others out there, but value stream it out. In fact, you'll see a lot of times, you Google Lean Six Sigma or Lean, you'll see sticky notes on a wall. And you get a group of people in a room and you put sticky notes as to what the process is. You know, I don't really care which way you do it, as long as you give me show the value stream, show the steps. What do they say? A picture is worth 1,000 words. So create that value stream, and then you can properly analyze it and prioritize the problems that you're coming up in that situation. So you analyze it, and then you can improve it. And those improvements, now the important thing is, and we talked about a TOPS model, so that's another thing to pull out of this is a TOPS. When you get that team in there and you're working on these improvements, make sure you allow everybody to speak, get their opinions, and don't throw any hand grenades. And what I mean by that is, you get a group of people and sometimes somebody throws out an idea, and next thing you know, you get somebody else who's laughing or saying that's ridiculous. No, I actually say that, you know, the more ridiculous the ideas, and oftentimes I will throw out the most ridiculous idea, because if I throw out the most ridiculous idea, it will actually not get there. It will get to somewhere in between, the more conservative and the more ridiculous, because you're stretching. And that's oftentimes you see that in negotiation, right? You get somebody that comes in really low, or somebody really high on something, and there's no way it's going to work. But you're doing that so you can kind of get to you can have a conversation. So make sure there's no grenades, and that's the facilitator's job, is to make sure that there's no grenades. So again, we're going to use the DMAIC model, and make sure you have that control at the end. You make sure you get a good control, and make sure that you have expectations. It's one of the #1 things that I see wrong with this. Remember the 5 principles of Lean. Customers define value, and then when you're working on, you know, identifying the problems, remember downtime, the categories of waste. And I'll say them one more time. We've got defects, overproduction, waiting, not utilizing people's talents, transporting, inventory, motion, and excess processing. So these tools right here, so I could see, you know, to kind of visualize this for you, you go back to your organization and you say, okay, here's our business problem. Here's the problem that we have. Here's the issues that we're seeing, the errors, the customer service issues, whatever the case might be. Here's the process from start to finish. Here's where it starts and here's where it finishes. Here's my team of people that are going to work on it with me. And here's what I want to get to. You get, if you're not the top person in your organization, you get the top person that you need to report to prove it. And then you get into the value stream mapping. And that's how I can visualize you guys going back and working on this process and taking these nuggets with you. All right, we're at our next polling question here. Have you used flowcharting to analyze current processes? So I'll give you a few seconds to answer that.
As a reminder, make sure if you can't see the blue screen, you may need to exit full screen mode to view the polling question. I'll give you guys several more seconds to fill out. Put your answers in. Okay, we'll go ahead and close the question. And let's share the results.
All right, so Yes, some have, quite a few have, but quite a few haven't. So flow charting is a very powerful tool to use. Again, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and that's why we use it. And again, there's many different types of flow charting available, or different process. There's swim lane diagrams, there's spaghetti diagrams. There's a number of different ones. Swim lane diagrams are often useful when you have different departments involved in a process. You might have HR and accounting and so on and so forth. So it's definitely a very powerful tool. I highly recommend that you use that, because again, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And just to give you some ideas, if you're wondering, is this us? Do we have an issue? Well, if you see variation in process cycle times, waiting for information to filter in, variations in processes, mistakes being made that are constantly having to be caught and fixed and corrected, complex structures or filing systems, excess management time and minute details, not enough time spent for higher level. And if you just generally feel like you're working harder and not smarter, these are symptoms that you may have some inefficiency in your organization. And certainly we could add into that if you have customer complaints, internal or external customers, as another process. And so the question often is, where do you start once you get into understanding your process? And this is what's called a SIPOC. So it's suppliers, inputs, process, outputs, customers. You can see it right. And basically where you start with is right in the middle with the process. And this is meant to be high level. This isn't the detailed flow chart yet. This is just the high level steps in the process. So that way you can understand what are the inputs and what are the outputs. And then you can understand who the suppliers are and the customers, and why would we want this? Well, the reason we would want this is because we may need to go to the detail shop, and this is obviously an auto example, or the service garage, or we may have to talk to the bank or the credit union in this case to help facilitate a better process for applying for credit. The outputs, we got paperwork. Well, our paperwork may be redundant and may be more than is required, things of that nature. So it allows us to really kind of see what's going on. And this can be a bit of a complicated process. Certainly if it's an easier process, you can go more with a simple, and ultimately what this does build into is a value stream map. And this is a very standard value stream. This is just a very basic one, but what we have here is shapes. And the reason we have shapes is, you can see, for example, we have the triangle that is waiting, okay? So anytime you see this waiting process, it could mean waiting for an answer, it could be sitting before it moves on. There's also manual processes, or decisions. So you can see we use this diamond for a decision. It could be, is it right, is it wrong? We send it backwards. You can see where we have arrows going backwards because our process doesn't flow. When you put this in a diagram with the actual steps of what you're doing, you can see exactly what the process is and where the problems are. Okay, so that's why we keep talking about the visual effect of this. Okay, so again, highly encourage the value stream map. Now, we've talked about defects, we've talked about other wastes in the system, and we talked about how we improve that. But one of the problems that you often come across is sometimes trying to fix that process, you stay too superficial in terms of understanding, why is this error happening? Why does this happen this way? Oftentimes, it kind of falls into two things. One, there's a significant issue that we've got to dig down deep into. The other issue is when you keep asking why, and you get resistance on why we can't change the process, and you keep asking, and we refer to this as the 5 whys. You keep asking why until you get down there. But oftentimes we hear, well, that's the way we've always done it. Well, that's not a good reason to keep doing it that way. So that's something that we want to dig into. And of course, there's this story of the Jefferson Memorial, and frankly, I don't know how this has gotten more of a story than it is reality over the years, but there's a story about the 5 whys where the Jefferson Memorial was crumbling, and the question was, well, why is it crumbling? And they thought it was acid rain, but it was really turned out to be excessive cleaning. And so, well, why are we cleaning it so much? And so they went and talked to the cleaning. Well, it's because there's pigeon poop all the time on it. Well, and so they asked the question, well, why is there pigeon poop all over it? And thinking it was different reasons, but ultimately, well, they said, well, there's all these spiders. And so the pigeon poops, because there's so many pigeons. Why so many pigeons? Well, there are all these spiders that were, they were eating. And the question is, well, why is there so many spiders here? Why is this? Well, what they found out is there's this other bug called these midges. Well, these midges would come out at dusk and would reproduce and die, and then the spiders would want to eat them. So the spiders showed up because that's where the food source is. So the pigeons showed up. So then the cleaning had to happen. So they tried digging in, and they said, well, why are all the midges here at this point in time? And what they ended up finding was when they turned the lights on at a certain point in time, when the midges were most active, the lights drew the midges into it, and that's when they did the reproductive and died and all that kind of stuff. So all they had to do was change the lighting sequence by 30 minutes later, and the midges stopped coming, which kept the spiders from coming, which kept the pigeons from coming, and reduced the amount of excessive washing. So it's kind of a fun story on asking the 5 whys and cause and effect. And that's what we really want to drill down to. Keep asking why until you get down to the root of the problem. For example, I talked about having a compliance issue with, this state law that they thought they were applying. When we went really digging down deep, they were applying something they didn't need to on that. And so, when we talk about project and process management, managing that front door, managing the expectations, managing the lead time goals, level loading, and then of course wrapping it up. We want to have good execution on this. Employees, we want them to feel ownership of this process. We want, of what you're doing. It could be the process you use, the project. And so when we talk about managing the front door, it's everything that's done prior to starting a project. It's being proactive. Maybe it's moving hours out of higher capacity periods. It's really being purposeful with what you're doing and setting expectations. And that becomes the thing is, oftentimes when I talk to management, I talk to organizations about expectations, and sometimes you'll hear frustrations from management about the projects that are not getting done or the processes that are not happening effectively. And I ask them, like, well, have you talked to people about what those expectations are? And of course, the answer is oftentimes no, they haven't set. They might have a process document, but nowhere in that process document does it even talk about expectations. In other words, what's the quality expectations? What's the time turnaround expectations? So it's really critical in terms of communication, and particularly if you're project oriented, or if you have quality that you have to be producing from one set to the next. Level loading. I want to talk about this a little bit more because it's an important concept. So 3 R's: right people, right roles, right time. Alleviates bottlenecks. So we want to use, I want to go back to what we were talking about before. We do want to make sure we have the right people doing the right thing. And I think you've heard of putting people in the right seats on the bus. So we want to make sure those people are in the right seats on the bus. Sometimes when you sit back and you evaluate somebody's strengths, you learn that this person does not excel in this. But if you go and if you put them in this particular scenario, they do excel. Well, let's make sure people are doing the right things, the things that make sense for our organization. And then delegation. And I think managers have, in any organization, have some of the most difficult times understanding what can be delegated, or they think they get so busy it's just faster to do it themselves. They think they have to do it themselves. And I think it's critical that, as leaders, you work with your people. It may not just be managers, it could be supervisor level or beyond, but how to delegate and what is delegation, and is it okay for somebody else? And of course, obviously, we have to make sure internal controls apply and things of that nature, but oftentimes you can find things that can be delegated down and produce more urgency for somebody else. And when we've talked to clients and been through these processes, it's amazing some of the things that they didn't realize that they could move, that they could get somebody else to, but it was just a communication thing. So it's a good idea to be through this, understand where are your bottlenecks, because then you can look at those tasks that bottleneck is at and say, what can we move around to alleviate this bottleneck? And then hopefully that you're getting things through the system much faster. In terms of now, of course, you may create another bottleneck somewhere because you're now moving it through so quickly that it's a situation of somebody else can. So you're going to have to look at that, and it's often what happens is you have bottlenecks created somewhere else, and so you just keep on working through the process. Wrapping it up, we have so many things that we can get right into the red zone, but we never get the project done. And what we want to do is really look at our WIP and implement pull, work on things, prioritize things, and get this work done, okay, and get it out of the completed. Real quickly, I wanted to, and then I'm going to get into a couple of examples here, but using Lean Six Sigma to address, the ongoing COVID problems as it relates to remote social distancing issues. And there's some methodologies just built in, and I want to just explain a few of them. We've talked about most of these, but one of them is Gemba walks. Again, another Japanese term, but it means go to the spot. So go to where the problem is. It could be customer service where people are coming in to pay for something. Go to that spot and watch. Just stand there and watch and see what's happening. Watch the flow of traffic. Watch the movement. Watch what's really, really happening. Get your own perspective. It's critical. And don't just do it for 5 minutes. Stand there for a little while. I know it can be unnerving for employees, but one of the things we also see with Gemba walks is that if you're walking through, just a quick walkthrough, employees, people performing a function can perform perfectly for 5 minutes. But if you stand there for 30 minutes watching and observing, it's really hard, and you're going to start seeing things that you may not have seen before. Of course, you walk through and you spend a couple of minutes, you're going to say, hey, everything's working perfectly as I want. So perform those Gemba walks, really go to the spot and see what's happening. Go out into the workplace, go out into the field, so to speak, and see what's happening so you get your own perspective and really observe with a critical eye, and not to make people nervous, but to really understand what's happening. Again, not so you can admonish them or say, hey, what's wrong with you, but so you can learn and so you can help improve the process. We talked about the 5 whys. Continue asking why until you get down to the root of the problem. It's root cause analysis. Of course, sometimes it may take more than 5 whys. It might take 3 whys, but it's just a terminology. We talked about value stream maps, spaghetti diagrams, visual management. I'm a big fan of visual management and putting things up on a board, for example, to see if things are moving properly. FMEA is failure modes, effects, and analysis. And basically what this is taking those problems and weighting them to see how risky they are for the organization or how much of an impact this is having, so you can prioritize your fixing things. And then of course there's rapid process improvement. Some of this stuff can take a lot of time to go through if you don't devote, but you can devote a team of people for a day, 2 days, 3 days, and just focus on it, solve it, and move on to the next problem. That's where rapid process improvement comes in. All right, this is our last polling question. Are your organizations considering process improvement initiatives?
All right, we'll give you guys several seconds to answer. Go ahead and log in your votes, please. Okay, we'll give another 10 seconds. And we'll close out the poll. And let's share the results. There you go.
Okay, yes. Okay. Well, then this is timely. I think it's the tools in here, of course, an hour and 15 minutes is barely time to touch on it, but I do think, again, I'm gonna, before I go through some of our, just a couple of quick case studies here, again, I'm gonna reiterate, use the DMAIC model, define, measure, analyze, improve, and control, okay? Understand what value is, understand customer value, understand internal and external, understand these, use the categories of waste to determine what your problems are, and then work off improving them. Make sure you have a control document. So this process sounds complicated, but it's, I think, really when at time it can sound complicated. Get into it, create a visual of your process, attack it. Okay, couple of basic case studies that we have here. Of course, these are a couple of city governments that we have worked with, but I do, I'll share a couple of, higher ed. I know we've got a mix of organizations on here, but I mentioned the housing one where we, how to leverage, these old school processes into a new set of processes for students moving in and out. We want to automate it. We've done things, and I think many of you know Katie Davis on the higher ed. She's usually very involved in these, but they're currently working on one that's evaluating a budget process, because so many higher education have departments with shadow systems and they don't have a standardized process. So they're working on that. Even examples of internal controls for ticket offices and how to make sure those controls are really in place, but along the line of making sure your internal controls are there, identifying areas of efficiency. So those are examples that you can use to apply this to. But here we have a case study of a change order process. And this was really an interesting situation, because we're talking about small dollar change orders. And even then, they could go up to 10 approvals before it went out the door. And it could take a couple of weeks to weeks before it would happen. And oftentimes, the work was basically already done and just waiting for us. So it would have been a problem for the city to not approve that change order after work had been done. The change orders were going through a dual process, both manually, which meant somebody was physically walking paper throughout the organization, and then a redundant electronic approval process. Certain personnel that were even involved in approving things, the approvals didn't even need to happen. And so, it was really kind of, it was unbelievable. And what we did was we literally put a flow chart together of step-by-step how this approval went all the way through. Eventually the commission would approve it. So what we wanted to do was minimize time to approve the change orders. That was our goal. So that, and you think about a charter being put together here, our goal was to improve that time frame. We want to eliminate the manual paperwork. They had a system that would work. We didn't need to, so we want to eliminate that, eliminate the travel, and eliminate redundant approvals. And ultimately, what we came up with was they have this quarterly, in order to make commission feel comfortable that they knew everything that was going on, there was a new quarterly report to the commission that included the change order activities. They changed the thresholds, and we went from approvals of 11, it ultimately got to 11, down to 3. Okay, so that's a substantial change. We eliminated the process of walking the change order form throughout the city, and the goal was that a change order get approved in a week, ultimately, and we were able to do that. That was a pretty substantial change. It was a problem. Commission was frustrated, staff was frustrated, vendors were frustrated, and basically all we did was, we didn't even realize how many approvals. They wouldn't have been able to tell me necessarily until we mapped it all out. And so you can visualize a flow chart up on the screen, and again, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and it was just really eye-opening. We also did one, it was just kind of neat because we had this HR performance review process, and the average past due in these performance reviews, so you can think about employees who were unfortunately not getting their performance reviews timely, is on average 84 days past due. They were using a manual process, again, of tracking when the evaluations were due. The performance review paperwork was super lengthy, and people were also applying different rating systems across departments. Some people would be rated really high, others who were superstars were being rated lower because just they didn't have a good definition of what the employees' jobs were in terms of these ratings. So we wanted to reduce the turnaround time, and we had the software available to track, notify, follow up, and it was just a matter of using it, learning it, and implementing it. And then we could get rid of spreadsheets and manual data entry and all that kind of stuff. And of course, we had to get the HR board to approve this. And basically what we did was we reduced the evaluation form from 10 pages down to 2 pages. We were able to get to this 30-day time frame, and employee evaluations moved to an automated system. It was a hugely, it was a big win. I mean, it wasn't a huge process necessarily, but it was a huge win for the organization. So you can see even simple processes can be affected. And remember, what's the goal? You know, even in those 2 cases, we were better able to utilize the resources of that particular city to focus on other things as opposed to all these automated manual methods. And by mapping it out, by defining the problem, then mapping it out, then analyzing it, then we were able to add improvements, and ultimately the controls were documents. You know, think about the HR piece. We had a process document that described it. We had new performance evaluations, a new automated system that we were able to use on this. So remember, that's the goal, is that efficient use of resources. And of course, it looks like we are literally running out of time here in the last minute. So if you do have questions, feel free to email me or give me a call. I'd be happy to chat. I know even on the higher ed, many of you know, again, Katie is also certified in Lean Six Sigma. She couldn't join us today, but give her a call. She'd be happy to answer questions as well. And I think it looks like our next webinar, I know there's a lot of people that have signed up for this. This is going to be a really neat session on Excel tips and tricks. So if you haven't signed up for that, certainly you can see the link. The link is in the presentation. There'll be more reminders coming out for us, but I think that's going to be an excellent summit webinar as well. And again, here's my contact information. It's in the slide should you need to reach out to me or you have a question and can reach me. And of course, here's the upcoming remaining summer CPE series. With that, thank you all for joining us. I know it was a very quick, but hopefully we're able to pull away some nuggets out of this to start applying internally. And again, feel free to give us a call if you have any questions.
And thank you, Mike, for all of your help. You'll see this on the list on screen right now. You have the remaining dates of our government CPE series and the topics. Well, thank you once again for attending our webinar. We hope you have a wonderful day.